Right. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aditi Vijay, who will moderate the panel along with Dr. Decker. Dr. Vijay is a clinical psychologist and assistant clinical professor at Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington. Along with her interest in predictors of change and success in treatment in emerging adults and the association between suicide and loneliness, Dr. Vijay's research is expanding to examine the role of race in the provision of therapy. With an interest in reducing stigma and supporting families, Dr. Vijay recently joined the board of NEABPD. Aditi, thank you so much for co-moderating the conference panel today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So excited to be here with you all. This has been just a wonderful, fact-filled day, and looking forward to processing some of what we've learned with you all over the next hour or so, 45 minutes. To keep our discussion lively as we hit the wrapping up portion, we're planning to divide up into two small groups so that we have a chance to talk a little bit more in depth and allow our panelists to have some interaction. So first, we're going to ask Amanda Wang, Nema Paley-Rose, Nadine LaRiviere, and Frank Yeomans to come up virtually. To the audience, if you have questions, please keep them coming and put them into the chat box. And we will, and for the presenters, we're going to direct questions to you each individually. At the same time, if we ask somebody else a question, we would love, and you have something you want to add, please feel free to jump in. We're trying to make this as close to a in real life experience as we can. So the first question is going to go to Amanda. And one of the questions I saw floating around earlier today was asking you about, you know, your relationship with your therapist was so instrumental and, you know, in change. And it sounds like, you know, you had multiple suicide attempts. And I think for some of the therapists out there, they were wondering, you know, is there something somebody could have done for you earlier that you might have found helpful?
Was there something that could have been done earlier? I honestly think I had to go through the pace that we did get through everything, because I think I wasn't ready to receive a lot of that information about who I was and being ready to express who I am to other people. So I think just came as soon as it did. Unfortunately, I did have a couple of suicide attempts, but luckily I came through them.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess just as a quick follow-up to that,
yes.
I think that, you know, that idea of being like change being a process is really an important part of what you're saying. And that I just want to highlight that as therapists and family members, sometimes we feel very pushed for people to have change. And I just think that part of what your experience is highlighting is that when the time was right or the work had been done, like that's when it kind of evolved into that. And so I thought that was a really powerful part of your talk, and wanted to give you the chance to comment on that further if you wanted to.
I often describe, I do dialectical behavior therapy, and I often describe it as like an ocean slowly eroding away a piece of rock into sand. It takes time, but it's a gradual process, and eventually we get to the end goal. So yeah, totally true.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Nama. One thing that came up a lot in the chat, and as people were listening to your story and your sister's story, was the power and the utility for you of having a diagnostic label, a language to talk about the experience. At the same time, we know that in a lot of communities where there's so much stigma, including the BPD community, there's some concern about having a diagnostic label and the challenges that can bring up. I wonder if you could expand on your thoughts a little bit about what was useful for you about this. How do you feel about the label issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think just for, at least for me, in the context of my sister, it's really only been liberating, because when we didn't know what her diagnosis was, it felt so impossible to know how to be supportive and to have the tools to communicate better and to be the sister that I hope to be. I do feel like quite grateful, and I think Bria will probably say mostly the same, that I don't feel like I've experienced a lot of negativity around the BPD label when I've shared it with people in my community. I don't think she has either, but she can also speak to that. She's sitting right here. I think that we really had a lot of positivity and support, and the label has enabled us to connect with other individuals with lived experience and with their family members and communities. I'm curious if my parents would say the same thing. My mom is sitting over there, because I think it might come with a different weight as a parent, and especially I think with the frustration of it having taken till my sister was in her mid-30s. So I feel like there is more stigma there and frustration around just years and years of different psychologists and how hard my mom tried to get a diagnosis and how long it took to get one. Although, of course, I now know that BPD can be a little bit of a complicated diagnosis, and that, of course, there's still experts in the field, although it's impossible for me to understand who don't think that it's like a accurate or real diagnosis and that it should have a different label. But for me, that feels really impossible to understand.
Thanks so much.
The next question is for you, Dr. Yeomans. Earlier on during your presentation, somebody asked if you could speak a bit more to targeting identity dysregulation in psychotherapy. So how can we help people to develop a coherent and more stable sense of self? And also, as a follow-up to that, in psychotherapy, how might we target developing a sense of self within relationships with other people?
That's a big question, so let me try to answer.
She did put the disclaimer, this is not a simple response, and we understand that, but anything you share would be wonderful.
Okay, because there's two things, or three or four. I'll try to stick to two. First of all, in terms of establishing an identity where somebody has identity diffusion, I want to go back to Nadine's talk, which I thought was really helpful, as all were. Because even though what I tend to do therapeutically with patients with personality disorders, of course we have to match the therapy to the patient, is based on psychoanalytic thinking. Everybody thinks psychoanalytic thinking is just all cerebral and so on and so forth. But we are very much in agreement with Nadine. I wouldn't take somebody into therapy if they weren't willing to engage in a serious life activity, because it's kind of a waste of time. You can just think and think and think. But if you're not engaged with the world and bringing back your reactions to those experiences, you're not really getting anywhere. So first of all, we anchor the work in reality. But then the other part is to work with what we call the transference. It's called transference-focused psychotherapy. And this is that idea I was trying to get at with the discussion of internal representations of self and other. Simple example. On one day, your patient comes in, this is the beginning of therapy, and they're very grateful and they appreciate that you're their therapist and they really love the thing you said in the last session. The next day, you're useless, they don't know why they come here, they're going to fire you. So those are two extremely different self experiences and experiences of the other. So my idea would be to help the person get to know each one of those self and other experiences, reflect on how they can coexist. They're the same person, I'm the same person. One day I'm great, the other day I'm horrible. One day they're happy, the next day they're miserable. How can we take a step back and think about these contradictions and try to put them together? Third element, then I'll stop. This I haven't talked about yet, but I think one thing that keeps a healthy identity from developing are harsh critical voices in the mind. So if you take a step, if you do what Nadine says to do, go out and get a job, the first time you flip that burger, you're not going to say, great, flip the burger. they're going to say, you flipped the burger on, you jerk. So then you get caught in this cycle of self-attack. And when you're caught in a cycle of self-attack, you grind to a halt. So you might have started out with healthy interests in life. You like gardening, you like sports, whatever you like. But if you've got that, what I call internal attack dog, that is unrecognized by you, but it's unleashed as soon as you take a step, you're never going to build an identity. So you have to help the person get to know that, get control of that, get involved in the world, look at how they're experiencing them in relation to us, and the whole package can lead to integration.
Thank you.
Nadine, I have a question for you, but I'm wondering if you have any responses to Dr. Yeoman first, given that I saw you just nodding and nodding.
Well,
Anything to
I'm
add?
in agreement. I'm in agreement. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know,
Oh, please.
I don't know why does everybody call me Dr. Yeoman and everybody else is Nadine? I'm trying to go by Frank here. Anyway.
Thank you so
Let you
much.
know.
I appreciate the feedback.
You're welcome.
Nadine, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the use of checklists in your work to help people assess vocational interests. Somebody posted the question that, given the difficulty that folks may have in identifying their own likes, their own preferences in BPD, how might you use a checklist with somebody who's really struggling with that piece?
Well, what is interesting
I'm having trouble
in
hearing
using
Nadine.
these.
Anybody else?
Me too.
You do?
I don't have sound.
No.
Oh dear.
Let me. I can
All
continue.
right. Malin, Stephen, do you think you could help Nadine with her microphone, please?
So
We
the
really
audience,
want to hear her.
we can all hear Nadine. So Nadine, you can keep talking. Yeah.
Thank
And then
you.
I'll let you know when
Okay.
she's done. Okay, guys?
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. So I was going to say that with the checklist, like the interest checklist, for example, what we would do is look at the person's history. It helps to find ideas. Everybody has done hobbies, has done activities from the school years, what they have done. Could be through observations of other family members as well, and build from there. And as an occupational therapist, because we know that these kinds of activities can provide pleasure, we would have clients engage in those in an exploratory way during therapy and rehabilitation, again, to be learning about themselves in action and reflecting back on these kinds of experiences. That's what we did in my practice during my clinical years. We would have clients get involved in a variety of activities to explore more about themselves. So there are always things that we like in life, but we might have to, do this kind of exercise more than once. Can be through a questionnaire, can be through another time through more of a projective type of activity, like through a collage. I see pictures, it triggers, some kind of positive feeling, and go from there.
All right. That was a great answer, Nadine. Thank you so much. Aditi, Suzanne, I think a next question would be awesome.
Okay. I think the next question is for Nama. And I was curious, Bria referenced a little bit being Jewish and culture just a little bit, I think, towards the end of your talk. And given the theme of identity here today, I'm just curious whether or not you felt like your family's identity as being Jewish, if that ever had any interplay in terms of stigma or getting help or receiving help, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I am sure that for religious communities in various contexts, it does come with stigma. We grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where everybody is a therapist, has a therapist. At least 80% of my friends' parents are therapists. My husband's mom's a therapist. So I don't think that there was stigma around that. I remember very distinctly, we grew up going to a Jewish day school through middle school. and there was a school psychologist, and he's an old friend of my parents. So I think that going to therapy, which now I'm very lucky to have a wonderful therapist who's well versed in BPD, and I feel like especially at the end of the year of this pandemic, like everybody I know quotes their therapist in every sentence. So I know that that's certainly not everywhere and not every community or every culture, but our particular Jewish community, probably because we grew up in like a very progressive area that's very pro talking about mental health. If anything, I'm hopeful that the nature of our religious community and the various communities we're part of helped us, and helped my mom specifically, I would say, seek out support for my sister and try to get diagnoses. It still took a long time to get to the right one, but I don't think it was because of stigma or lack of trying.
Thank you.
Great. I've got a question for you, Nadine. This poster writes, I recently learned about treatment of BPD in Canada. The clinicians were discussing self-harm as an occupation itself, rather than a coping skill to manage emotions as we might think of it in other treatments. And the question is, as an occupational therapist, do you discuss this with your clients? And do you look at self-harm as a coping skill or as an occupation?
I think I would answer that I would look at it broadly. Like substance use is another example that I would look at it broadly, in the sense that I would look at elements of context. I would look at it at what function does it have in the person's life. It has a purpose, it has a function, it has a meaning or different types of meaning. That's how I would go about it. But it could turn out that in the end, for the person, the function of self-harm is a coping skill. But the way I would talk about it is more in a more broad way.
Thank you. And thank you all, Amanda, Nama, Nadine, and Frank. We're going to go ahead and switch to the second panel.
All right.
But from the bottom of our hearts, we really thank you for being with us today and sharing your experiences and expertise. As we switch, we're going to invite up Bria Paley, Angela Harvey, Alex Kiroglian, and Clarissa Cooper to allow the audience to ask some additional questions. And so again, if you've got questions, please pop them into the chat box. And to the presenters who are coming up or already here, feel free to jump in and add a response if you are so inclined. I think that the first question I have is directed towards Clarissa. There were tons of questions coming in from your talk. And one of the ones specifically asked, sorry, my computer's moving a little bit, if you've made any adaptations of interpersonal effectiveness skills where much of DBT is grounded in white supremacy and the skills come out of that. So I think you alluded to this earlier when you were describing how a dear man might not quite work with your family, and as you were doing your mom's voice, I could just hear my father saying, like, I'm not really interested in the impact on you, and that that skill would not have been effective. So I'm curious, and people in the audience are as well, if you have made any adaptations, and if not, have you thought about it, or what kinds of things might you think of doing?
Yeah, so we're consistently in our group making adaptations to a lot of the skills in terms of like just adding in new concepts and ideas or ways to apply. So with interpersonal effectiveness, we do talk about the tendency for Black women, for example, to be seen as laborers for other people's emotions, for creating the space to give to others and not necessarily tend to themselves. And so we talk a lot about the importance of like, how do we use give the give skill, which is for relationship effectiveness, but like that tendency to overuse give because we've been conditioned to do so, and what it looks like to actually do a little bit more self-respect effectiveness versus doing give or dear man, which is for objectives effectiveness. So those tend to be the ways that we do our adaptations. It's about how are we applying the concepts, not necessarily changing the actual language of the skills, but what's the angle and the nuance we have to keep in mind. And also talking a lot about where is the best place to seek support, right? Sometimes we can't change the environment, right? My mom's going to be like, okay, girl, I don't care at the end of the day. And the same with your father might be, I don't care about the impact. And so there's also that importance of talking about a broader community, right? If you're not able to change your environment, because they're too grounded and entrenched in a particular perspective, who are the other people you're in relationship with that are going to be more responsive, that are able to hear your requests and honor your requests?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Angela, I have a question for you. You spoke with so much passion about the work that you've been doing, the growth that you've been finding in yourself and seeing in others. Somebody in the from the audience was really asking, like, what was the inner drive that helped you stay motivated when things were challenging? Where do you find that energy?
The biggest piece for me was my God-given assignment to empower and enlighten other people. So thus, I'm wanting to stay sane. The other piece is I'm driven by the things that I cannot do to get those things done. And so for me to be in a space and place in relationship with someone and me not be able to navigate, I absolutely, upon finding out what I was doing wrong and what I did not get quite right, was driven to be able then to find ways to be able to apologize, to be able to bring myself to my own attention. And so that I just got this internal thing that says, keep growing, keep growing, keep growing. And I realize that not everybody has it. So I allow what does drive me to drive me. And I would just suggest to people to find what drives you, what pushes you, what makes you go beyond, and use that, whatever that is, as long as it's not illegal.
Wise words. Thank you.
I think that the next question goes to Alex. And something that a couple of people in the audience were wondering around your presentation was about the increase that we're seeing in people talking about and exploring gender dysphoria, where, the idea of just being transgendered, how to be respectful of that, feels new to many people. And so some of the questions were geared towards wondering if it's a new phenomenon, what it might have been called before, just like trying to understand the context of it more generally.
Yeah, it's a great question, and a question that I think often comes up in the VPD focused circles as well, just because it challenges some fundamental ways in which we respond to experiences that we hear about from our clients and from the communities that we work with. Gender diversity has existed throughout history and in every country and at every point in time. It's something that has by and large been suppressed to varying degrees, or maybe oppressed by society, the same way diversity in terms of sexual orientation and sexual behavior has existed throughout time in every country and in every city, town, village. We just haven't really accommodated it because it necessitates an understanding of, appreciation of, and tolerance of diversity that I think hasn't always been present. In certain cultures and in certain points in history, more room has been made for diversity in terms of gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. I think what's happened recently, and this is, there are sociologists and historians who are better at this than I am, I'm a psychiatrist, but I think what happened in the 20th century is that we had you know, a movement toward sexual liberation, women's liberation. There was revolution in terms of gay rights and diversity in terms of sexual orientation. And all of that kind of set the stage for a political movement and a cultural movement that finally starts to make some room, I think we're just at the beginning, for gender diversity that exists among humans. And this idea that your inner sense of what your gender is not determined necessarily in any way by the sex you were assigned when you were born, and that we don't just have two categories of gender among humans, of women and men, that gender exists as a continuum, and it's not binary, the same way eye color isn't binary, height isn't binary, skin color isn't binary. And that's very new for people. It gets at something very primal in terms of the way we make sense of human experience and the way society is structured based on patriarchy and binary notions of gender. One interesting thing that we care about a lot and are focused on it in the field is this sense that you can have gender diversity and break down the binary in terms of gender and not erase the identities of women and the strides that have been made in terms of women's rights and feminism, that it's a both and intersectional understanding of feminism and of gender diversity. So there's a lot that could be said, but I think it's a very exciting kind of revolutionary moment we're in society right now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bria, I have a question for you. I'd asked your sister something similar, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Hearing your story, I was struck by sort of the power of having a diagnostic label in the way that you were describing it. And we also know that in the BPD community, in many communities where there's a lot of stigma, having a label has some problematic features to it. Tell us, if you would, what you think about having a diagnostic label. Has that been helpful for you? Is it problematic for you? What's your experience with that?
So for me, it's been helpful because I was able to find out more about what BPD means, connect with people who also have a diagnosis. But I am aware of the stigma and that people feel they've been misdiagnosed. I've learned about it from all sorts of ways. I mean, more recently, it's been on TV shows like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, and it's been explored that way. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question with stigma. I've found that for me, it's better to be honest and forthcoming about this diagnosis. But other people are more private about it, and that's their right. Yeah, I guess that's what I'd say about a label.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and it's your experience.
Brings it back to your identity in a way, right, Bria? For sure. I have temporarily perhaps exchanged with Aditi because Aditi was having microphone, and so she was having a hard time hearing the answers. And I have actually a question from the audience for both of you, Clarissa and Alex. Can we compare gender identity stressors and racial identity stressors in relation to diagnosis and treatment? Gender affirming treatment and racial discrimination / identity affirming treatment, if you will. Any thoughts on how aligned or the parallel paths? They're not, well, they do intersect sometimes, but the parallel path of the treatment for both.
Alex, would you like to respond first?
Clarissa, would you? Oh, Alex, go ahead.
Clarissa, please feel free to start. I'm happy to follow you.
Yeah, so, I think that, let me pull the question back up. It was a very complicated question, so I want to make sure that I'm noticing it. I think that what I talk about a lot with my clients are how do their symptoms of borderline personality disorder, how are they exacerbated by how their racial identity stressors show up as well as their gender identity stressors, and what are the similarities. And so we do a lot of, in the work with my clients, a lot of working on how do they understand themselves with, like, embedded in their racial identity? How do they see themselves embedded within their culture as well, their racial culture as well? And so when I'm working with my clients who are navigating gender identity stressors, we also talk about how they've developed a sense of self, especially around the ideas of masculinity and femininity. What messages have they picked up from society and from culture, the cultures that they're in, that inform how they view themselves, how they think they're supposed to show up or not show up, and then how that leads to criticism and judgment about themselves. And similar questions that I ask with my clients around race as well. So what are the messages you've learned and you've internalized? And then how does that exacerbate or intersect with some of the dysregulating tendencies that come with borderline personality disorder?
Yes, you bring it back to identity always. And you spoke about that very compellingly in your presentation. Thank you, Clarissa. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I love what Clarissa said. I think that there are important similarities and differences. Certainly, the minority stress framework that we use to understand the experiences of transgender and gender diverse people, I think, is a framework that has value when thinking about and working with a variety of minoritized populations. The idea of chronically developmentally experiencing everyday discrimination, victimization, microaggressions, frank violence, the adverse impact that that can have on general psychological processes, internalizing the stigma that society has about your identity, whether it's racism or transphobia, for example, how that can lead to mistrust of caretakers and healthcare providers. So, discomfort, maybe trusting and attaching with caregivers, and the adverse impact that can have on mental health outcomes and behavioral health outcomes. I think there are some very important differences as well, and it's often intersectional, right? There are people who have both experiences. One important difference is that if you're experiencing racism as, say, a Black, Indigenous, or person of color in the U.S., it's often your family of origin and your community of origin that understands your experience. And when you go out into the world, there's invalidation, people don't understand your experience. When you're a sexual or gender minority person, typically your family of origin, your community of origin maybe is not accepting of you. And then you kind of venture out into the world to find community, to find a family of choice, because your experience is so different from the family that you come from. So that's one interesting difference, perhaps.
Interesting and very powerful and profound. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Benji, I wonder, what are your thoughts on this intersectionality, the conversation that we're having? I mean, those are two elements that you touched on in your presentation. Do you from a lived experience, family member, lived experience, what are your thoughts?
Well, I do know that because as I attempted to do in my presentation, different things, different parts of my identity had me feeling different things. So definitely the African American in me that is used to operating in this place of strength and place of empowerment, and those types of things, having to navigate that, or should I say being unable to navigate that, absolutely left me feeling very weak and weak-spirited and weak-minded. The LGBTQ person in me, of course, I was on the forefront with HRC when we were just trying to be seen 20-something years ago. So, there's a conscious effort I make in attempting to make these relationships work because, all eyes are on us. And so from every different angle there seemed, and as I began to write, I'm like, oh my goodness, even leaving out a few of my intersectionalities, it's just it becomes more difficult, but it also allows you to see things from a different perspective. So as a therapist myself, I'm able to see things from different arenas that absolutely help me in that space. But of course, when you're going through it, I could have done without some of those things. Because the hurt then The pain has been impactful on so many different levels. On the upswing, there is a joy that comes out of it. I'm in the midst of right now, as I'm able to even have a relationship with my ex, the joy that comes with finally being able to see something, finally being able to see at all is absolutely the other piece of that. But most people have a difficult time getting to that place. I definitely knew that joy would come in the morning time. So I was going to sleep as long as I needed to sleep to get there.
Thank you. Thank you. Aditi,
yep. I think hopefully you all can hear me. The next question is for both Bria and Angela. And Angela, you mentioned during your presentation a little bit about self-diagnosis via Google. And I was wondering if it might be something that you both could speak to just about the temptations, the pitfalls, and even the potential like validation in what you might find on the internet.
I'll jump in there to go first only because I did that and I did it the absolute wrong way. In my head, I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, so this is what it is. And as soon as they learn what it is, they're going to jump right on it and then we get back to living again. And again, it did not happen that way. As a clinician, I should have known better. The more I learned about DBT and the types of therapy that we use specifically, I know that they almost go out of their way not to bring forth this diagnosis with this title or this label in that. And I had all I thought was, hey, if they could know what it is and we can get it fixed, then here's what I think you are. So it did not work. It did good for me to inhale the information. It did not do good for me to dispense that information in the way that I did. I believe that Google and YouTube has, of course, our website as well, has an amazing array of different things relating to DBT and for BPD that I think absolutely works. I would have never found out, even though I heard of it, I would have never known specifically had I not done that search. I would have probably pulled out more of my hair, and as you can see, I don't have a whole lot left.
Yeah, so I never Googled it. I really didn't know hardly anything about it, as I said in my presentation, other than that my cousin had been diagnosed and I considered her to be fairly challenging. So I thought, oh no, like now this is my diagnosis. But, looking at the criteria, I really identified with it, of course. And I've read a lot of great material. I've been in relationships where I've obviously disclosed I have BPD, and they've, the person has said to me, well, what can I do? How can I learn more about it? And I thought, oh, that's such a nice question, but like, what's the answer? Like, like what is it that I can tell them to read, or, that won't scare them away? So that's still a challenge, I feel. I don't have an easy answer to that one, but Google's great for a lot of things. I often Google the DSM just to kind of familiarize myself with it when I explain it to people, because there are like 9 criteria and it's hard to remember them all. So I think Google's okay for some things.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's part of what's important, right? It's not all good or all bad. It's just figuring out how to be strategic about it. And I think even within both of your stories, there's been some of both. It's a mix. So thank you for sharing that.
Clarissa, there are a lot of questions for you. Here's one. There was a question about this concept of non-scarcity. And the audience member writes, I'm probably being concrete, but in the field of mental health, there actually is a shortage of providers, and I find myself overworking to address it. And Clarissa has disappeared temporarily. So no fear. We've got a lot of questions to get through. Let's see. Alex, I'm wondering if you might speak with us a little bit about difficulties how to kind of navigate if you encounter a client who is sort of unapologetically not interested in the teaching you have on gender identity and gender fluidity. When you get resistance from people who say, no, this stuff isn't real. How do you as a healthcare professional handle that? Thank you for your patience, everybody. Minor technical glitches, and we are all still here. We were just asking Alex a question about how he handles it as a healthcare professional when he encounters prejudice and pushback from patients who are saying, no, I don't really believe in the identities that you're trying to educate me about. It must happen in your work, Alex. How do you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, it's typically a conversation we're only having if the patient, themselves is expressing a transgender or gender diverse identity. I'm, certainly not trying to make anybody have a gender identity that they don't have. So I think the reason it doesn't necessarily play out that way with patients is that it's typically initiated by them or in the context of a clinical history being elicited and history of gender identity development, that it emerges from the patient or client themselves that they, are exploring their gender identity or transgender or gender diverse or potentially interested in considering a gender affirmation process. I think where a lot of resistance comes up is in our national training and technical assistance we do with healthcare teams and clinicians, where there's a very low knowledge fund, I would say, about gender diversity and gender affirmative healthcare. So we have our work cut out for us with clinicians, but it's not part of the standard curriculum for a variety of health professionals. But with patients, it's, we're meeting them where they're at, and it's typically coming from them if they are expressing their own gender diversity.
One of the many reasons we all appreciate your work so much as you're educating the rest of the healthcare field. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Bria. You compellingly spoke about what happened during the pandemic. Like this time last year, the family relations were better, and all we have is perhaps 1 minute. So short answer on this. But sort of the pandemic, social environment created a change. Can you just say a little bit more about
that? So what it was like during the pandemic, or I missed some of the question.
How did the pandemic, the conditions of the pandemic affect you particularly?
Yeah, so it was really, I'm single and I live alone, and it was hard to feel like I might be isolated from other people when New York was under shelter in place. I did have a partner at the time who lived in another borough, and I wasn't willing to not see him. So yeah, I did what I felt was best really for my mental health above everything else. I think after being diagnosed with BPD, COVID really didn't feel that scary to me, to be honest.
What a statement. What a statement, Bria. Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for sharing this. Well, I think thank you. I want to thank you, panelists, so much. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but thank you for being here and answering a few more questions and sort of finishing the day with these additional insights. So thank you for your presence here. And that concludes our day. Yes. So Suzanne, I will let you, you're hearing.
Yep, I'm here. So we want to thank all of our presenters today for teaching us, for inspiring us, for moving us. We're so grateful for your willingness, for your energy, for your sharing your experiences, your wisdom, and your research findings. We have a big thank you for Brand Live for helping us carry out our first ever virtual conference, which has meant we've been able to have audience members here from all across the United States and multiple nations, and making for our conference to run so smoothly. So Malin, Jeremiah, Stephen, all of the rest of the team, thank you so much. We have, as usual, a huge thank you to our volunteers who've been working tirelessly behind the scenes for months. And a special shout out to Emily Edwards, who's been coordinating volunteers and just making sure that everything goes as it should. This conference was developed by Perry Hoffman and Seth Axelrod, and we owe all of them a debt of gratitude for their thoughtfulness and their hard work in creating this partnership. This conference is now in its 16th year, and we look forward to many, many, many more. As we wrap up today, a few reminders. You'll receive an email for a Qualtrics evaluation, and the link will be posted below in the chat. Please fill out this evaluation to tell us what you liked about our conference today and how we can improve. This evaluation is also critical to your CEs if you requested them. If you requested them, CEs will be mailed to you after we've received confirmation of your attendance and your evaluation, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Our presenters, you were incredible. What a day this has been. Thank you so much for being here and for teaching us in so many ways. We hope to see everybody next year. Thank you to our audience for being here today. And so next year, the date of the conference will be Friday, May 6th, 2022, for the next Yale-NEABPD conference. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.